This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Villette by Charlotte Brontë. Chapter 28. The Watchguard. Monsieur Paul Emanuel owned an acute sensitiveness to the annoyance of interruption, from whatsoever cause occurring during his lessons. To pass through the class under such circumstances was considered by the teachers and pupils of the school, individually and collectively, to be as much as a woman's or girl's life was worth. Madame Beck herself, if forced to the enterprise, would scurry through, retrenching her skirts and carefully coasting the formidable estrade like a ship dreading breakers. As to Rosine, the portress, on whom every half-hour devolved the fearful duty of fetching pupils out of the very heart of one or other of the divisions to take their music lessons in the oratory, the great or little saloon, the salle à manger, or some other piano station, she would, upon her second or third attempt, frequently become almost tongue-tied from excess of consternation, a sentiment inspired by the unspeakable looks levelled at her through a pair of dart-dealing spectacles. One morning I was sitting in the car at work upon a piece of embroidery which one of the pupils had commenced but delayed to finish, and while my fingers wrought at the frame, my ears regaled themselves with listening to the crescendos and cadences of a voice haranguing in the neighbouring class, in tones that waxed momentarily more unquiet, more ominously varied. There was a good strong partition wall between me and the gathering storm, as well as a facile means of flight through the glass door to the court, in case it swept this way. So I am afraid I derived more amusement than alarm from these thickening symptoms. Poor Rosine was not safe. 4 times that blessed morning had she made the passage of peril, and now, for a 5th time, it became her dangerous duty to snatch, as it were, a brand from the burning, a pupil from under Monsieur Paul's nose. Mon Dieu, she cried, que vais-je devenir? Monsieur va me tuer, je suis sûre, car il est d'une couleur. Nerved by the courage of desperation, she opened the door. "Mademoiselle la Malle au piano!" was her cry. Ere she could make good her retreat, or quite close the door, this voice uttered itself. "Dès ce moment, la classe est défendue. La première qui ouvrira cette porte, ou passera par cette division, sera pendue. Fausse Madame Beck elle-même." 10 minutes had not succeeded the promulgation of this decree, when Rosine's French pantoufles were again heard shuffling along the corridor. "Mademoiselle," said she, "I would not for a 5-franc piece go into that class again just now. Monsieur's lunettes are really terrible, and here is a commissionnaire come with a message from the Athénée. I have told Madame Beck I dare not deliver it, and she says I am to charge you with it." "Me? No, that is rather too bad. It is not in my line of duty. Come, come, Rosine, bear your own burden. Be brave, charge once more." "I, mademoiselle? Impossible! 5 times I have crossed him this day. Madame really must hire a gendarme for this service. Ouf! Je ne puis plus." "Bah, you are only a coward. What is the message?" "Precisely of the kind with which Monsieur least likes to be pestered. An urgent summons to go directly to the Athénée, as there is an official visitor inspector, I know not what, arrived, and Monsieur must meet him. You know how he hates a must." Yes, I knew well enough. The restive little man detested spur or curb; against whatever was urgent or obligatory he was sure to revolt. However, I accepted the responsibility. Not certainly without fear, but fear blent with other sentiments, curiosity amongst them. I opened the door, I entered, I closed it behind me as quickly and quietly as a rather unsteady hand would permit; for to be slow or bustling, to rattle a latch, or leave a door gaping wide, were aggravations of crime often more disastrous in result than the main crime itself. There I stood then, and there he sat. His humour was visibly bad, almost at its worst. He had been giving a lesson in arithmetic, for he gave lessons on any and every subject that struck his fancy, and arithmetic being a dry subject, invariably disagreed with him. Not a pupil but trembled when he spoke of figures. He sat, bent above his desk, to look up at the sound of an entrance, at the occurrence of a direct breach of his will and law, was an effort he could not for the moment bring himself to make. It was quite as well. I thus gained time to walk up the long classe, and it suited my idiosyncrasy far better to encounter the near burst of anger like his, than to bear its menace at a distance. At his estrade I paused, just in front. Of course I was not worthy of immediate attention. He proceeded with his lesson. Disdain would not do. He must hear, and he must answer my message. Not being quite tall enough to lift my head over his desk, elevated upon the estrade, and thus suffering eclipse in my present position, I ventured to peep round, with the design at first of merely getting a better view of his face, which had struck me when I entered as bearing a close and picturesque resemblance to that of a black and sallow tiger. Twice did I enjoy this side view with impunity, advancing and receding unseen. The third time, my eye had scarce dawned beyond the obscuration of the desk, when it was caught and transfixed through its very pupil, transfixed by the lunettes. Rosine was right. These utensils had in them a blank and immutable terror, beyond the mobile wrath of the wearer's own unglazed eyes. I now found the advantage of proximity. These short-sighted lunettes were useless for the inspection of a criminal under Monsieur's nose. Accordingly, he doffed them, and he and I stood on more equal terms. I am glad I was not really much afraid of him, that, indeed, close in his presence, I felt no terror at all. For upon his demanding cord and gibbet to execute the sentence recently pronounced, I was able to furnish him with a needleful of embroidering thread with such accommodating civility as could not but allay some portion at least of his surplus irritation. Of course, I did not parade this courtesy before public view. I merely handed the thread round the angle of the desk, and attached it, ready noosed, to the barred back of the Professor's chair. "Comme voulez-vous?" said he in a growl, of which the music was wholly confined to his chest and throat, for he kept his teeth clenched, and seemed registering to himself an inward vow that nothing earthly should wring from him a smile. My answer commenced uncompromisingly. "Monsieur," I said, "je veux l'impossible des choses ennuyées." And thinking it best not to mince matters, but to administer the douche with decision, in a low but quick voice, I delivered the Athenian message, floridly exaggerating its urgency. Of course, he would not hear a word of it. He would not go, he would not leave his present class, let all the officials of Villette send for him, he would not put himself an inch out of his way at the bidding of king, cabinet, and chambers together. I knew, however, that he must go, that, talk as he would, both his duty and interest commanded an immediate and literal compliance with the summons. I stood, therefore, waiting in silence, as if he had not yet spoken. He asked what more I wanted. "Only Monsieur's answer to deliver to the commissionaire." He waved an impatient negative. I ventured to stretch my hand to the bonnet grec which lay in its grim repose upon the window-sill. He followed this daring movement with his eye, no doubt in mixed pity and amazement at its presumption. "Ah," he muttered, "if it came to that, if Miss Lucy meddled with his bonnet grec, she might just put it on herself, turn garçon for the occasion, and benevolently go to the attorney in his stead." With great respect, I laid the bonnet on the desk, where its tassels seemed to give me an awful nod. "I'll write a note of apology, that will do," said he, still bent on the evasion. Knowing well it would not do, I gently pushed the bonnet toward his hand. Thus impelled, it slid down the polished slope of the varnished and unbathed desk, carried before it the slight steel-framed lunettes, and, fearful to relate, they fell to the estrade. A score of times ere now had I seen them fall and receive no damage. This time, as Lucy Snow's hapless luck would have it, they so fell that each clear pebble became a shivered and shapeless star. Now indeed dismay seized me, dismay and regret. I knew the value of these lunettes. Monsieur Paul's sight was peculiar, not easily fitted, and these glasses suited him. I had heard him call them his treasures. As I picked them up, cracked and worthless, my hand trembled. Frightened through all my nerves, I was to see the mischief I had done, but I think I was even more sorry than afraid. For some seconds I dared not look the bereaved Professor in the face. He was the first to speak. "Là," he said, "me voilà veuf de mes lunettes. I think Mademoiselle Lucy will now confess that the cord and gallows are amply earned. She trembles in anticipation of her doom. Ah, traîtresse, traîtresse, you are resolved to have me quite blind and helpless in your hands." I lifted my eyes. His face, instead of being irate, lowering and furrowed, was overflowing with the smile, coloured with the bloom I had seen brightening in it that evening at the Hôtel Crécy. He was not angry, not even grieved. For the real injury he showed himself full of clemency; under the real provocation, patient as a saint. This event, which seemed so untoward, which I thought had ruined at once my chance of successful persuasion, proved my best help. Difficult of management so long as I had done him no harm, he became graciously pliant as soon as I stood in his presence a conscious and contrite offender. Still gently railing at me as une faute femme, une Anglaise terrible, un petit casse-tout, he declared that he dared not but obey one who had given such an instance of her dangerous prowess. It was absolutely like the grand emperor smashing the vase to inspire dismay. So at last, crowning himself with his bonnet grec, and taking his ruined lunettes from my hand with a clasp of kind pardon and encouragement, he made his bow, and went off to the Athénée in first-rate humour and spirits. After all this amiability, the reader will be sorry for my sake to hear that I was quarrelling with M. Paul again before night, yet so it was, and I could not help it. It was his occasional custom, and a very laudable, acceptable custom too, to arrive of an evening, always à l'improviste, unannounced, burst in the silent hour of study, establish a sudden despotism over us and our occupations, cause books to be put away, work-bags to be brought out, drawing forth a single thick volume or a handful of pamphlets, substitute for the besotted lecture pieuse drawled by a sleepy pupil, some tragedy made grand by grand reading, ardent by fiery action, some drama whereof, for my part, I rarely studied the intrinsic merit. For Monsieur Emanuel made it a vessel for an outpouring, and filled it with his native verve and passion like a cup with a vital brewage. Or else he would flash through our conventual darkness a reflex of a brighter world, show us a glimpse of the current literature of the day, read us passages from some enchanting tale, or the last witty feuilleton which had awakened laughter in the saloons of Paris, taking care always to expunge, with the severest hand, whether from tragedy, melodrama, tale, or essay, whatever passage, phrase, or word could be deemed unsuited to an audience of jeunes filles. I noticed more than once that where retrenchment without substitute would have left unmeaning vacancy, or introduced weakness, he could and did improvise whole paragraphs, no less vigorous than irreproachable. The dialogue, the description, he engrafted, was often far better than that he pruned away. Well, on the evening in question, we were sitting silent as nuns in a retreat, the pupils studying, the teachers working. I remember my work. It was a slight matter of fancy, and it rather interested me. It had a purpose. I was not doing it merely to kill time. I meant it when finished as a gift, and the occasion of presentation being near, haste was requisite, and my fingers were busy. We heard the sharp bell peal, which we all knew, then the rapid step familiar to each ear. The words "Voilà, monsieur," had scarcely broken simultaneously from every lip, when two-leaved doors split, as split it always did for his admission (such a slow word as open is ineffective to describe his movements), and he stood in the midst of us. There were two study tables, both long and flanked with benches. Over the centre of each hung a lamp. Beneath this lamp, on either side the table, sat a teacher. The girls were arranged to the right hand and the left, the eldest and most studious nearest the lamps or tropics, the idlers and little ones towards the north and south poles. Monsieur's habit was politely to hand a chair to some teacher, generally Zélie St. Pierre, the senior mistress, then to take her vacated seat, and thus avail himself of the full beam of Cancer or Capricorn, which, owing to his near sight, he needed. As usual, Zélie rose with alacrity, smiling to the whole extent of her mouth, and the full display of her upper and under rows of teeth. That strange smile which passes from ear to ear, and is marked only by a sharp thin curve, which fails to spread over the countenance, and neither dimples the cheek nor lights the eye. I suppose Monsieur did not see her, or he had taken a whim that he would not notice her, for he was as capricious as women are said to be. Then his lunettes—he had got another pair—served him as an excuse for all sorts of little oversights and shortcomings. Whatever might be his reason, he passed by Zélie, came to the other side of the table, and before I could start up to clear the way, whispered, "Ne bougez pas," and established himself between me and Miss Fanshawe, who always would be my neighbour, and have her elbow at my side, however often I declared to her, "Ginevra, I wish you were at Jericho." It was easy to say "Ne bougez pas," but how could I help it? I must make him room, and I must request the pupil to recede that I might receive. It was very well for Ginevra to be gummed to me, keeping herself warm, as she said, on the winter nights, and harassing my very heart with her fidgetings and pokings, obliging me indeed sometimes to put an artful pin in my girdle by way of protection against her elbow. But I suppose M. Emanuel was not to be subjected to the same kind of treatment, so I swept away my working materials to clear space for his book, and withdrew myself to make room for his person, not, however, leaving more than a yard of interval, just what any reasonable man would have regarded as convenient, respectful allowance of bench. But M. Emanuel never was reasonable. Flint and tinder that he was, he struck and took fire directly. "Vous ne voulez pas de moi, pour voisin," he growled. "Vous vous donnez des airs de caste. Vous me traitez en pariah," he scowled. "Soit! Je vais arranger les choses." And he set to work. "Levez-vous toutes, mademoiselles," he cried. The girls rose. He made them all file off to the other table. He then placed me at one extremity of the long bench, and having duly and carefully brought me my work-basket, silk, scissors, all my implements, he fixed himself quite at the other end. At this arrangement, highly absurd as it was, not a soul in the room dared to laugh. Luckless for the giggler would have been the giggle. As for me, I took it with entire coolness. There I sat, isolated and cut off from human intercourse. I sat and minded my work, and was quiet, and not at all unhappy. "Est-ce assez de distance?" he demanded. "Monsieur en est l'arbitre," said I. "Vous savez bien que non. C'est vous qui avez créé ce vide immense. Moi, je n'y ai pas mis la main." And with this assertion he commenced the reading. For his misfortune, he had chosen a French translation of what he called un drame de William Shakespeare, le faux Dieu. He further announced de ce sot païen des Anglais. How far otherwise he would have characterized him had his temper not been upset, I scarce need intimate. Of course, the translation being French was very inefficient, nor did I make any particular effort to conceal the contempt which some of its forlorn lapses were calculated to excite. Not that it behoved or beseemed me to say anything, but one can occasionally look the opinion it is forbidden to embody in words. Monsieur's lunettes being on the alert, he gleaned up every stray look. I don't think he lost one. The consequence was, his eyes soon discarded a screen, that their blaze might sparkle free, and he waxed hotter at the North Pole, to which he had voluntarily exiled himself, than, considering the general temperature of the room, it would have been reasonable to become under the vertical ray of Cancer itself. The reading over, it appeared problematic whether he would depart with his anger unexpressed, or whether he would give it vent. Suppression was not much in his habits, but still, what had been done to him definite enough to afford matter for overt reproof. I had not uttered a sound, and could not justly be deemed amenable to reprimand or penalty for having permitted a slightly freer action than usual to the muscles around my eyes and mouth. The supper, consisting of bread and milk diluted with tepid water, was brought in. In respectful consideration of the Professor's presence, the rolls and glasses were allowed to stand instead of being immediately handed round. "Take your supper, ladies," said he, seeming to be occupied in making marginal notes to his William Shakespeare. They took it. I also accepted a roll and glass, but being now more than ever interested in my work, I kept my seat of punishment, and wrought while I munched my bread and sipped my beverage, the whole thing with easy sang-froid, and a certain smugness of composure. Indeed, scarcely in my habits, and pleasantly novel to my feelings. It seemed as if the presence of nature so restless, chafing, thorny as that of Monsieur Paul, absorbed all feverish and unsettling influences like a magnet, and left me none but such as were placid and harmonious. He rose. Will he go away without saying another word? Yes. He turned to the door. No. He returned on his steps, but only perhaps to take his pencil case, which had been left on the table. He took it, shut the pencil in and out, broke its point against the wood, recut and pocketed it, and walked promptly up to me. The girls and teachers gathered round the other table were talking pretty freely. They always talked at meals, and, from the constant habit of speaking fast and loud at such times, did not now subdue their voices much. Monsieur Paul came and stood behind me. He asked at what I was working, and I said I was making a watch-guard. He said, "For whom?" And I answered, "For a gentleman, one of my friends." Monsieur Paul stooped down and proceeded, as novel writers say, and was literally true in his case, to hiss into my ear some poignant words. He said that, of all the women he knew, I was the one who could make herself the most consummately unpleasant. I was she with whom it was least possible to live on friendly terms. I had a caractère intraitable, and perverse to a miracle. How I managed it, or what possessed me, he, for his part, did not know. But with whatever pacific and amicable intentions a person accosted me, crac! I turned concord to discord, goodwill to enmity. He was sure he, Monsieur Paul, wished me well enough. He had never done me any harm that he knew of. He might at least, he supposed, claim a right to be regarded as a neutral acquaintance, guiltless of hostile sentiments. Yet how I behaved to him! With what pungent vivacities! What an impetus of mutiny! What a fougue of injustice! Here I could not avoid opening my eyes somewhat wide, and even slipping in a slight interjectional observation. Vivacities? Impetus? Fougue? I didn't know. Chut! À l'instant! There I went, vive comme la poudre. He was sorry. He was very sorry. For my sake he grieved over the hapless peculiarity. This emportement, this chaleur, generous perhaps, but excessive, would yet, he feared, do me a mischief. It was a pity. I was not, he believed, in his soul, wholly without good qualities, and would I but hear reason, and be more sedate, more sober, less en l'air, less coquette, less taken by show, less prone to set an undue value on outside excellence, to make much of the attentions of people remarkable chiefly for so many feet of stature, des couleurs de poupée, un nez plus ou moins bien fait, and an enormous amount of fatuity, I might yet prove a useful, perhaps an exemplary character. But as it was, and here the little man's voice was for a moment choked, I would have looked up at him, or held out my hand, or said a soothing word. But I was afraid, if I stirred, I should either laugh or cry. So odd in all this was the mixture of the touching and the absurd. I thought he had nearly done, but no, he sat down that he might go on at his ease. While he, Monsieur Paul, was on these painful topics, he would dare my anger for the sake of my good, and would venture to refer to a change he had noticed in my dress. He was free to confess that when he first knew me, or rather, was in the habit of catching a passing glimpse of me from time to time, I satisfied him on this point. The gravity, the austere simplicity, obvious in this particular, were such as to inspire the highest hopes for my best interests. What fatal influence had impelled me lately to introduce flowers under the brim of my bonnet, to wear des cols broads, and even appear for one occasion in a scarlet gown? He might indeed conjecture, but for the present he would not openly declare. Again I interrupted, and this time not without an accent at once indignant and horror-struck. Scarlet, Monsieur Paul? It was not scarlet. It was pink, and pale pink too, and further subdued by black lace. Pink or scarlet, yellow or crimson, pea-green or sky-blue, it was all one. These were all flaunting, giddy colours, And as to the lace I talked of, that was but a colifichet de plus." And he sighed over my degeneracy. He could not, he was sorry to say, be so particular on this theme as he could wish, not possessing the exact names of these babillots. He might run into small verbal errors, which would not fail to lay him open to my sarcasm, and excite my unhappily sudden and passionate disposition. He would merely say in general terms, and in these general terms he knew he was correct, that my costume had of late assumed des façons mondaines, which it wounded him to see. What façons mondaines he discovered in my present winter merino and plain white collar, I owned it puzzled me to guess; and when I asked him, he said it was all made with too much attention to effect, and besides, had I not a bow of ribbon at my neck? "And if you condemn a bow of ribbon for a lady, monsieur, would you necessarily disapprove of a thing like this for a gentleman?" holding up my bright little chainlet of silk and gold. His sole reply was a groan, I suppose over my levity. After sitting some minutes in silence, and watching the progress of the chain, at which I now wrought more assiduously than ever, he inquired whether what he had just said would have the effect of making me entirely detest him. I hardly remember what answer I made, or how it came about. I don't think I spoke at all, but I know we managed to bid good night on friendly terms, and, even after Monsieur Paul had reached the door, he turned back just to explain that he would not be understood to speak in entire condemnation of the scarlet dress. "Pink! Pink!" I threw in. That he had no intention to deny the merit of looking rather well. The fact was, M. Emanuel's taste in colours decidedly leaned to the brilliant; only he wished to counsel me, whenever I wore it, to do so in the same spirit, as if its material were beurre, and its hue gris de poussière. "And the flowers under my bonnet, monsieur?" I asked. "They are very little ones." "Keep them little, then," said he. "Permit them not to become full blown." "And the bow, monsieur, the bit of ribbon?" "Va pour le ruban," was the propitious answer. And so we settled it. "Well done, Lucy Snowe!" cried I to myself. "You have come in for a pretty lecture, brought on yourself a rude savant, and all through your wicked fondness for worldly vanities. Who would have thought it? You deemed yourself a melancholy sober sides enough. Miss Fanshawe there regards you as a second Diogenes. Monsieur de Bassompierre the other day politely turned the conversation, when it ran on the wild gifts of the actress Vashti, because, as he kindly said, Miss Snowe looked uncomfortable. Dr. John Bretton knows you only as quiet Lucy, a creature inoffensive as a shadow. He has said, and you have heard him say it, Lucy's disadvantages spring from over-gravity in tastes and manner, want of colour in character and costume. Such are your own and your friends' impressions, and behold, there starts up a little man, differing diametrically from all these, roundly charging you with being too airy and cheery, too volatile and versatile, too flowery and coloury. This harsh little man, this pitiless censor, gathers up all your poor scattered sins of vanity, your luckless chiffon of rose colour, your small fringe of a wreath, your small scrap of ribbon, your silly bit of lace, and calls you to account for the lot, and for each item. You are well habituated to being passed by as a shadow in life's sunshine. It is a new thing to see one testily lifting his hand to screen his eyes, because you tease him with an obtrusive ray. End of chapter 28, The Washguard. Read by Tora in Campbellsburg, Kentucky, October 2006. It's a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Villette by Charlotte Brontë. Chapter 29. Monsieur's Fête. I was up the next morning an hour before daybreak, and finished my guard, kneeling on the dormitory floor beside the centre stand, for the benefit of such expiring glimmer as the night lamp afforded in its last watch. All my materials, my whole stock of beads and silk, were used up before the chain assumed the length and richness I wished. I had wrought it double, as I knew, by the rule of contraries, that to suit the particular taste whose gratification was in view, an effective appearance was quite indispensable. As a finish to the ornament, a little gold clasp was needed. Fortunately, I possessed it in the fastening of my sole necklace. I duly detached and reattached it, then coiled compactly the completed guard, and enclosed it in a small box I had bought for its brilliancy, made of some tropic shell of the colour called nacarat, and decked with a little coronal of sparkling blue stones. Within the lid of the box I carefully graved with my scissors' point certain initials. The reader will, perhaps, remember the description of Madame Beck's fête, nor will he have forgotten that at each anniversary a handsome present was subscribed for and offered by the school. The observance of this day was a distinction accorded to none but Madame, and, in a modified form, to her kinsman and counsellor, Monsieur Emanuel. In the latter case it was an honour spontaneously awarded, not plotted and contrived beforehand, and offered an additional proof, amongst many others, of the estimation in which, despite his partialities, prejudices, and irritabilities, the professor of literature was held by his pupils. No article of value was offered to him. He distinctly gave it to be understood that he would accept neither plate nor jewellery. Yet he liked a slight tribute. The cost, the money value, did not touch him. A diamond ring, a gold snuff-box, presented with pomp, would have pleased him less than a flower or a drawing, offered simply and with sincere feelings. Such was his nature. He was a man, not wise in his generation, yet could claim a filial sympathy with the dayspring on high. M. Paul's fête fell on the 1st of March and a Thursday. It proved a fine sunny day, and being likewise the morning on which it was customary to attend mass, being also otherwise distinguished by half-holiday which permitted the privilege of walking out, shopping, or paying visits in the afternoon. These combined considerations induced a general smartness and freshness of dress. Clean collars were in vogue. The ordinary dingy woollen class dress was exchanged for something lighter and clearer. Mademoiselle Zélie St. Pierre, on this particular Thursday, even assumed a robe de soie, deemed in economical Labassecour an article of hazardous splendour and luxury. Nay, it was even remarked that she sent for a coiffeur to dress her hair that morning. There were pupils acute enough to discover that she had bedewed her handkerchief and her hands with a new and fashionable perfume. Poor Zélie! It was much her wont to declare about this time that she was tired to death of a life of seclusion and labour, that she longed to have the means and leisure for relaxation, to have some one to work for her, a husband who would pay her debts (she was woefully encumbered with debts), supply her wardrobe, and leave her at liberty, as she said, to goûter un peu les plaisirs. It had long been rumoured that her eye was upon Monsieur Emanuel. Monsieur Emanuel's eye was certainly often upon her. He would sit and watch her perseveringly for minutes together. I have seen him give her a quarter of an hour's gaze, while the class was silently composing, and he sat throned on his estrade, unoccupied. Conscious always of this basilisk attention, she would writhe under it, half flattered, half puzzled, and Monsieur would follow her sensations, sometimes looking appallingly acute, for in some cases he had the terrible unerring penetration of instinct, and pierced in its hiding-place the last lurking thought of the heart, and discerned under florid veilings the bare, barren places of the spirit. Yes, and its perverted tendencies, and its hidden false curves, all that men and women would not have known, the twisted spine, the malformed limb that was born with them, and far worse, the stain or disfigurement they have perhaps brought on themselves. No calamity so accursed but Monsieur Emanuel could pity and forgive, if it were acknowledged candidly; but where his questioning eyes met dishonest denial, where his ruthless researches found deceitful concealment, oh, then he could be cruel, and I thought wicked. He would exultantly snatch the screen from poor shrinking wretches, passionately hurry them to the summit of the mount of exposure, and there show them all naked, all false, poor living lies, the spawn of that horrid truth which cannot be looked on unveiled. He thought he did justice. For my part, I doubt whether man has a right to do justice on man. More than once in these his visitations I have felt compelled to give tears to his victims, and not spared ire and keen reproach to himself. He deserved it, but it was difficult to shake him in his firm conviction that the work was righteous and needed. Breakfast being over and mass attended, the school bell rang and the rooms filled. A very pretty spectacle was presented in class. Pupils and teachers sat neatly arrayed, orderly, and expectant, each bearing in her hand the bouquet of felicitation, the prettiest spring flowers, all fresh and filling the air with their fragrance. I only had no bouquet. I like to see flowers growing, but when they are gathered, they cease to please. I look on them as things rootless and perishable. Their likeness to life makes me sad. I never offer flowers to those I love. I never wish to receive them from hands dear to me. Mademoiselle St. Pierre marked my empty hands. She could not believe I had been so remiss. With avidity her eye roved over and round me. Surely I must have some solitary symbolic flower somewhere, some small knot of violets, something to win myself praise for taste, commendation for ingenuity. The unimaginative Anglaise proved better than the Parisienne's fears. She sat literally unprovided, as bare of bloom or leaf as the winter tree. This ascertained, Zélie smiled, well pleased. "How wisely you have acted to keep your money, Miss Lucy," she said. "Silly I have gone and thrown away 2 francs on a bouquet of hothouse flowers." And she showed with pride her splendid nosegay. But hush! A step, the step. It came prompt as usual, but with a promptitude we felt disposed to flatter ourselves, inspired by other feelings than mere excitability of nerve and vehemence of intent. We thought our professor's footfall, to speak romantically, had in it a friendly promise this morning, and so it had. He entered in a mood which made him as good as a new sunbeam to the already well-lit first class. The morning light playing amongst our plants and laughing on our walls caught an added lustre from Monsieur Paul's all benignant salute. Like a true Frenchman, though I don't know why I should say so, for he was of a strain neither French nor Labassecourienne, he had dressed for the situation and the occasion. Not by the vague folds, sinister and conspirator-like, of his soot-dark paletot were the outlines of his person obscured. On the contrary, his figure, such as it was, I don't boast of it, was well set off by a civilized coat and a silken vest quite pretty to behold. The defiant and pagan bonnet grec had vanished. Bare-headed, he came upon us, carrying a Christian hat in his gloved hand. The little man looked well, very well. There was a clearness of amity in his blue eye, and a glow of good feeling on his dark complexion, which passed perfectly in the place of beauty. One really did not care to observe that his nose, though far from small, was of no particular shape, his cheek thin, his brow marked and square, his mouth no rosebud. One accepted him as he was, and felt his presence the reverse of damping or insignificant. He passed to his desk. He placed on the same his hat and gloves. "Bonjour, mes amis," said he, in a tone that somehow gave amends to some amongst us for many a sharp snap and savage snarl; not a jocund, good-fellow tone, still less an unctuous priestly accent, but a voice he had belonging to himself, a voice used when his heart passed the words to his lips. That same heart did speak sometimes, though an irritable, it was not an ossified organ. In its core was a place, tender beyond a man's tenderness, a place that humbled him to little children, that bound him to girls and women to whom, rebel as he would, he could not disown his affinity, nor quite deny that, on the whole, he was better with them than with his own sex. "We all wish Monsieur a good day, and present to him our congratulations on the anniversary of his fête," said Mademoiselle Zélie, constituting herself spokeswoman of the assembly, and advancing with no more twists of affectation than were with her indispensable to the achievement of motion, she laid her costly bouquet before him. He bowed over it. The long train of offerings followed, all the pupils, sweeping past with the gliding step foreigners practise, left their tributes as they went by. Each girl so dexterously adjusted her separate gift that when the last bouquet was laid on the desk, it formed the apex to a blooming pyramid, a pyramid blooming, spreading, and towering with such exuberance as, in the end, to eclipse the hero behind it. This ceremony over, seats were resumed, and we sat in dead silence expectant of a speech. I suppose 5 minutes might have elapsed, and the hush remained unbroken. 10, and there was no sound. Many present began, doubtless, to wonder for what Monsieur waited, as well they might. Voiceless and viewless, stirless and wordless, he kept his station behind the pile of flowers. At last there issued forth a voice, rather deep, as if it spoke out of a hollow. "Est-ce cela tout?" Mademoiselle Zélie looked around. "You have all presented your bouquets?" inquired she of the pupils. Yes, they had all given their nosegays, from the eldest to the youngest, from the tallest to the most diminutive. The senior mistress signified as much. "Est-ce cela tout?" was reiterated in an intonation which, deep before, had now descended some notes lower. "Monsieur," said Mademoiselle St. Pierre, rising, and this time speaking with her own sweet smile, "I have the honour to tell you that, with a single exception, every person in class has offered her bouquet. For Meess Lucy, Monsieur will kindly make allowance. As a foreigner, she probably did not know our customs, or did not appreciate their significance. Meess Lucy has regarded this ceremony as too frivolous to be honoured by her observance." "Famous!" I muttered between my teeth. "You are no bad speaker, Zélie, when you begin." The answer vouchsafed to Mademoiselle St. Pierre from the estrade was given in the gesticulation of a hand from behind the pyramid. This manual action seemed to deprecate words, to enjoin silence. A form ere long followed the hand. Monsieur emerged from his eclipse, and producing himself on the front of his estrade, and gazing straight and fixedly before him at a vast map monde covering the wall opposite, he demanded a third time, and now in really tragic tones, "Est-ce cela tout?" I might yet have made it all right by stepping forwards and slipping into his hand the ruddy little shell-box I at that moment held tight in my own. It was what I had fully purposed to do. But first the comic side of Monsieur's behaviour had tempted me to delay, and now Mademoiselle St. Pierre's affected interference provoked contumacity. The reader, not having hitherto had any cause to ascribe to Miss Snow's character the most distant pretensions to perfection, will scarcely be surprised to learn that she felt too perverse to defend herself from any imputation the Parisienne might choose to insinuate. And besides, Monsieur Paul was so tragic, and took my defection so seriously, he deserved to be vexed. I kept, then, both my box and my countenance, and sat insensate as any stone. "It is well," dropped at length from the lips of Monsieur Paul, and having uttered this phrase, the shadow of some great paroxysm, the swell of wrath, scorn, resolve, passed over his brow, rippled his lips, and lined his cheeks. Gulping down all further comment, he launched into his customary discourse. I can't at all remember what this discourse was. I did not listen to it. The gulping down process, the abrupt dismissal of his mortification or vexation, had given me a sensation which half counteracted the ludicrous effect of the reiterated "Est-ce cela tout?" Towards the close of the speech there came a pleasing diversion. My attention was again amusingly arrested. Owing to some little accidental movement, I think I dropped my thimble on the floor, and in stooping to regain it, hit the crown of my head against the sharp corner of my desk, which casualties, exasperating to me by rights, if to anybody, naturally made a slight bustle. Monsieur Paul became irritated, and dismissing his forced equanimity, and casting to the winds that dignity and self-control with which he never cared long to encumber himself, he broke down into the strain best calculated to give him ease. I don't know how, in the progress of his discourse, he had contrived to cross the Channel and land on British ground, but there I found him when I began to listen. Casting a quick, cynical glance around the room, a glance which scathed, or was intended to scathe, as it crossed me, he fell with a fury on les Anglaises. Never have I heard English women handled as Monsieur Paul that morning handled them. He spared nothing, their minds, morals, manners, nor personal appearance. I specially remember his abuse of their tall stature, their long necks, their thin arms, their slovenly dress, their pedantic education, their impious scepticism, their insufferable pride, their pretentious virtue, over which he ground his teeth malignantly, and looked as if, had he dared, he would have said singular things. Oh, he was spiteful, acrid, savage, and, as a natural consequence, detestably ugly. Wicked little venomous man, thought I, am I going to harass myself with fears of displeasing you or hurting your feelings? No, indeed. You shall be indifferent to me as the shabbiest bouquet in your pyramid. I grieve to say I could not quite carry out this resolution. For some time the abuse of England and the English found and left me stolid. I bore it some 15 minutes stoically enough. But this hissing cockatrice was determined to sting, and he said such things at last, fastening not only upon our women, but upon our greatest names and best men, sullying the shield of Britannia, and dabbling the Union Jack in mud, that I was stung. With vicious relish he brought up the most spicy current continental historical falsehoods, than which nothing could be conceived more offensive. Zélie and the whole class became one grin of vindictive delight, for it is curious to discover how these clowns of la basse cour secretly hated England. At last I struck a sharp stroke on my desk, opened my lips, and let loose this cry: "Vive l'Angleterre, l'histoire et les héros! À bas la France, la fiction et les faquins!" The class was struck of a heap. I suppose they thought me mad. The professor put up his handkerchief and fiendishly smiled into its folds. Little monster of malice! He now thought he had got the victory since he had made me angry. In a second he became good-humoured. With great blandness he resumed the subject of his flowers, talked poetically and symbolically of their sweetness, perfume, purity, etc., made Frenchified comparisons between the jeunes filles and the sweet blossoms before him, paid Mademoiselle St. Pierre a very full-blown compliment on the superiority of her bouquet, and ended by announcing that the first really fine, mild, and balmy morning in spring he intended to take the whole class out to breakfast in the country. Such of the class, at least, he added, with emphasis, as he could count amongst the number of his friends. "Donc, je n'y serai pas," declared I involuntarily. "Soit," was his response, and gathering his flowers in his arms, he flashed out of class, while I, consigning my work, scissors, thimble, and the neglected little box to my desk, swept upstairs. I don't know whether he felt hot and angry, but I am free to confess that I did. Yet, with a strange evanescent anger, I had not sat an hour on the edge of my bed, picturing and repicturing his look, manner, words, ere I smiled at the whole scene. A little pang of regret I underwent that the box had not been offered. I had meant to gratify him. Fate would not have it so. In the course of the afternoon, remembering that desks in class were by no means inviolate repositories, and thinking that it was as well to secure the box, on account of the initials in the lid, P.C.D.E., for Paul, Carl, or Carlos, David, Emmanuel, such was his full name, these foreigners must always have a string of baptismals, I descended to the schoolroom. It slept in holiday repose. The day pupils were all gone home, the boarders were out walking, the teachers, except the surveillant of the week, were in town, visiting or shopping, the suite of divisions was vacant. So was the grande salle, with its huge solemn globe hanging in the mist, its pair of many-branched chandeliers, and its horizontal grand piano closed, silent, enjoying its mid-week Sabbath. I rather wondered to find the first-class door ajar, this room being usually locked when empty, and being then inaccessible to any save Madame Beck and myself, who possessed a duplicate key. I wondered still more, on approaching, to hear a vague movement as of life, a step, a chair stirred, a sound like the opening of a desk. "It is only Madame Beck doing inspection duty," was the conclusion following a moment's reflection. The partially opened door gave opportunity for assurance on this point. I looked. Behold, not the inspecting garb of Madame Beck, the shawl and the clean cap, but the coat and close-shorn dark head of a man. This person occupied my chair. His olive hand held my desk open. His nose was lost to view amongst my papers. His back was towards me, but there could not be a moment's question about identity. Already was the attire of ceremony discarded. The cherished and ink-stained paletot was resumed. The perverse bonnet grec lay on the floor, as if dropped from the hand, culpably busy. Now I knew, and I had long known, that the hand of M. Emanuel's was on the most intimate terms with my desk, that it raised and lowered the lid, ransacked and arranged the contents, almost as familiarly as my own. The fact was not dubious, nor did he wish it to be so. He left signs of each visit palpable and unmistakable. Hitherto, however, I had never caught him in the act. Watch as I would, I could not detect the hours and moments of his coming. I saw the brownie's work and exercises left overnight full of faults, and found the next morning carefully corrected. I profited by his capricious goodwill in loans full welcome and refreshing. Between a sallow dictionary and worn-out grammar would magically grow a fresh interesting new work, or a classic mellow and sweet in its ripe age. Out of my work-basket would laughingly peep a romance. Under it would lurk the pamphlet, the magazine, whence last evening's reading had been extracted. Impossible to doubt the source whence these treasures flowed. Had there been no other indication, one condemning and traitor peculiarity common to them all settled the question. They smelt of cigars. This was very shocking, of course. I thought so at first, and used to open the window with some bustle, to air my desk, and with fastidious finger and thumb to hold the piquant brochures forth to the purifying breeze. I was cured of that formality suddenly. Monsieur caught me at it one day, understood the inference, instantly relieved my hand of its burden, and in another moment would have thrust the same into the glowing stove. It chanced to be a book on the perusal of which I was bent, so for once I proved as decided and quicker than himself, recaptured the spoil, and having saved this volume, never hazarded a second. With all this, I had never yet been able to arrest in his visits the freakish, friendly, cigar-loving phantom. But now at last I had him. There he was, the very brownie himself, and there, curling from his lips, was the pale blue breath of his Indian darling. He was smoking into my desk. It might well betray him. Provoked at this particular, and yet pleased to surprise him, pleased, that is, with the mixed feeling of the housewife who discovers at last her strange elfin ally busy in the dairy at the untimely churn, I stole softly forward, stood behind him, bent with precaution over his shoulder. My heart smote me to see that, after this morning's hostility, after my seeming remissness, after the puncture experienced by his feelings, and the ruffling undergone by his temper, he, all willing to forget and forgive, had brought me a couple of handsome volumes, of which the title and authorship were guarantees for interest. Now, as he sat bending above the desk, he was stirring up its contents, but with gentle and careful hand. Disarranging indeed, but not harming. My heart smote me. As I bent over him, as he sat unconscious, doing me what good he could, and I dare say not feeling toward me unkindly, my morning's anger quite melted. I did not dislike Professor Emanuel. I think he heard me breathe. He turned suddenly. His temperament was nervous, yet he never started, and seldom changed colour. There was something hearty about him. "I thought you were gone into town with the other teachers," said he, taking a grim gripe of his self-possession, which half escaped him. "It is as well you are not. Do you think I care for being caught? Not I. I often visit your desk." "Monsieur, I know it." "You find a brochure or tome now and then, but you don't read them because they have passed under this," touching his cigar. "They have, and are no better for the process, but I read them." "Without pleasure?" "Monsieur must not be contradicted." "Do you like them, or any of them? Are they acceptable?" "Monsieur has seen me reading them 100 times, and knows I have not so many recreations as to undervalue those he provides." "I mean well, and if you see that I mean well, and derive some amusement from my efforts, why can we not be friends?" "A fatalist would say because we cannot." "This morning," he continued, "I awoke in a bright mood, and came into the class happy. You spoiled my day." "No, monsieur, only an hour or two of it, and that unintentionally." "Unintentionally?" "No, it was my fête day. Everybody wished me happiness but you. The little children of the third division gave each her knot of violets, lisped her congratulation. You, nothing. Not a bud, leaf, whisper, not a glance. Was this unintentional?" "I meant no harm." "Then you really did not know our custom? You were unprepared? You would willingly have laid out a few centimes on a flower to give me pleasure, had you been aware that it was expected? Say so, and all is forgotten, and the pain soothed." "I did know that it was expected. I was prepared, yet I laid out no centimes on flowers." "It is well. You do right to be honest. I should almost have hated you had you flattered and lied. Better declare at once, Paul Carl Emmanuel, je te déteste, mon garçon, than smile in interest, look in affection, and be false and cold at heart. False and cold I don't think you are, but you have made a great mistake in life, that I believe. I think your judgment is warped, that you are indifferent where you ought to be grateful, and perhaps devoted and infatuated where you ought to be as cool as your name. Don't suppose that I wish you to have a passion for me, mademoiselle. Dieu vous en garde. What do you start for? Because I said passion? Well, I say it again. There is such a word, there is such a thing, though not within these walls, thank heaven. You are no child, that one should not speak of what exists. But I only uttered the word. The thing, I assure you, is alien to my whole life and views. It died in the past. In the present it lies buried. Its grave is deep dug, well heaped, and many winters old. In the future there will be a resurrection, as I believe to my soul's consolation, but all will then be changed. Form and feeling, the mortal will have put on immortality. It will rise not for earth, but for heaven. All I say to you, Miss Lucy Snowe, is, that you ought to treat Professor Paul Emanuel decently." I could not and did not contradict such a sentiment. "Tell me," he pursued, "when it is your fête day, and I will not grudge a few centimes for a small offering." "You will be like me, monsieur. This cost more than a few centimes, and I did not grudge its price." And taking from the open desk the little box, I put it into his hand. "It lay ready in my lap this morning," I continued, "and if monsieur had been rather more patient, and Mademoiselle St. Pierre less interfering, perhaps I should say, too, if I had been calmer and wiser, I should have given it then." He looked at the box. I saw its clear warm tint and bright azure circlet pleased his eyes. I told him to open it. "My initials!" said he, indicating the letters in the lid. "Who told you I was called Carl David?" "A little bird, monsieur." "Does it fly from me to you? Then one can tie a message under its wing when needful." He took out the chain, a trifle indeed as to value, but glossy with silk and sparkling with beads. He liked that too, admired it artlessly like a child. "For me?" "Yes, for you." "This is the thing you were working at last night?" "The same." "You finished it this morning?" "I did." "You commenced it with the intention that it should be mine?" "Undoubtedly." "And offered on my fête day?" "Yes." "This purpose continued as you wove it?" Again I assented. "Then it is not necessary that I should cut out any portion, saying, 'This part is not mine, it was plaited under the idea and for the adornment of another?'" "By no means. It is neither necessary, nor would it be just." "This object is all mine?" "That object is yours entirely." Straightway Monsieur opened his paletot, arranged the guards splendidly across his chest, displaying as much and suppressing as little as he could, for he had no notion of concealing what he admired and thought decorative. As to the box, he pronounced it a superb bonbonnière. He was fond of bonbons, by the way, and as he always liked to share with others what pleased himself, he would give his dragees as freely as he lent his books. Amongst the kind brownies gifts left in my desk, I forgot to enumerate many a paper of chocolate comfits. His tastes in these matters were southern, and what we think infantine. His simple lunch consisted frequently of a brioche, which, as often as not, he shared with some child of the third division. "À présent, c'est un fait accompli," said he, readjusting his paletot, and we had no more words on the subject. After looking over the 2 volumes he had brought, and cutting away some pages with his penknife (he generally pruned before lending his books, especially if they were novels, and sometimes I was a little provoked at the severity of his censorship, the retrenchments interrupting the narrative), he rose, politely touched his bonnet grec, and bade me a civil good day. We are friends now, thought I, till the next time we quarrel. We might have quarrelled again that very same evening, but, wonderful to relate, failed for once to make the most of our opportunity. Contrary to all expectation, Monsieur Paul arrived at the study hour. Having seen so much of him in the morning, we did not look for his presence at night. No sooner were we seated at lessons, however, than he appeared. I own I was glad to see him, so glad that I could not help greeting his arrival with a smile. And when he made his way to the same seat about which so serious a misunderstanding had formerly arisen, I took good care not to make too much room for him. He watched with a jealous sidelong look to see whether I shrank away, but I did not, though the bench was a little crowded. I was losing the early impulse to recoil from Monsieur Paul. Habituated to the paletot and bonnet grec, the neighbourhood of these garments seemed no longer uncomfortable or very formidable. I did not now sit restrained, asphyxié, as he used to say, at his side. I stirred when I wished to stir, coughed when it was necessary, even yawned when I was tired; did, in short, what I pleased, blindly reliant upon his indulgence. Nor did my temerity, this evening at least, meet the punishment it perhaps merited. He was both indulgent and good-natured; not a cross glance shot from his eyes, not a hasty word left his lips. Till the very close of the evening he did not indeed address me at all, yet I felt somehow that he was full of friendliness. Silence is of different kinds, and breathes different meanings. No words could inspire a pleasanter content than did Monsieur Paul's wordless presence. When the tray came in, and the bustle of supper commenced, he just said, as he retired, that he wished me a good night and sweet dreams, and a good night and sweet dreams I had. End of Chapter 29. Monsieur's Fête. Read by Tora in Campbellsburg, Kentucky, October 2006.
Is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This recording by Opheliad in New South Wales, Australia, October 2006. Villette by Charlotte Brontë. Chapter 30. Monsieur Paul. Yet the reader is advised not to be in any hurry with his kindly conclusions, or to suppose with an over-hasty charity that from that day Monsieur Paul became a changed character, easy to live with and no longer apt to flash danger and discomfort around him. No, he was naturally a little man of unreasonable moods. When overwrought, which he often was, he became acutely irritable, and besides, his veins were dark with a livid belladonna tincture, the essence of jealousy. I do not mean merely the tender jealousy of the heart, but that sterner, narrower sentiment whose seat is in the head. I used to think, as I sat looking at Monsieur Paul while he was knitting his brow or protruding his lip over some exercise of mine, which had not as many faults as he wished, for he liked me to commit faults, a knot of blunders was sweet to him as a cluster of nuts, that he had points of resemblance to Napoleon Bonaparte. I think so still. In a shameless disregard of magnanimity, he resembled the great emperor. Monsieur Paul would have quarrelled with 20 learned women, would have unblushingly carried on a system of petty bickering and recrimination with a whole capital of coteries, never troubling himself about loss or lack of dignity. He would have exiled 50 Madame de Staëls if they had annoyed, offended, outrivalled, or opposed him. I well remember a hot episode of his with a certain Madame Panache, a lady temporarily employed by Madame Beck to give lessons in history. She was clever, that is, she knew a good deal, and, besides, thoroughly possessed the art of making the most of what she knew. Of words and confidence she held unlimited command. Her personal appearance was far from destitute of advantages. I believe many people would have pronounced her a fine woman. And yet there were points in her robust and ample attractions, as well as in her bustling and demonstrative presence, which, it appeared, the nice and capricious tastes of Monsieur Paul could not away with. The sound of her voice, echoing through the carré, would put him into a strange taking. Her long free step, almost stride, along the corridor would often make him snatch up his papers and decamp on the instant. With malicious intent he bethought himself one day to intrude on her class. As quick as lightning he gathered her method of instruction. It differed from a pet plan of his own. With little ceremony and less courtesy, he pointed out what he termed her errors. Whether he expected submission and attention I know not. He met an acrid opposition, accompanied by a round reprimand for his certainly unjustifiable interference. Instead of withdrawing with dignity, as he might still have done, he threw down the gauntlet of defiance. Madame Panache, bellicose as a Penthesilea, picked it up in a minute. She snapped her fingers in the intermeddler's face. She rushed upon him with a storm of words. Monsieur Emmanuel was eloquent, but Madame Panache was voluble. A system of fierce antagonism ensued. Instead of laughing in his sleeve at his fair foe, with all her sore amour-propre and loud self-assertion, Monsieur Paul detested her with intense seriousness. He honoured her with his earnest fury. He pursued her vindictively and implacably, refusing to rest peaceably in his bed, to derive due benefit from his meals, or even serenely to relish his cigar, till she was fairly rooted out of the establishment. The Professor conquered, but I cannot say that the laurels of this victory shadowed gracefully his temples. Once I ventured to hint as much. To my great surprise he allowed that I might be right, but averred that, when brought into contact with either men or women of the coarse self-complacent quality, whereof Madame Panache was a specimen, he had no control over his own passions. An unspeakable and active aversion impelled him to a war of extermination. 3 months afterwards, hearing that his vanquished foe had met with reverses and was likely to be really distressed for want of employment, he forgot his hatred, and, alike active in good and evil, he moved heaven and earth till he found her a place. Upon her coming to make up former differences and thank him for his recent kindness, the old voice, a little loud, the old manner, a little forward, so acted upon him that in 10 minutes he started up and bowed her, or rather himself, out of the room, in a transport of nervous irritation. To pursue a somewhat audacious parallel in a love of power, in an eager grasp after supremacy, Monsieur Emmanuel was like Bonaparte. He was a man not always to be submitted to. Sometimes it was needful to resist. It was right to stand still, to look up into his eyes and tell him that his requirements went beyond reason, that his absolutism verged on tyranny. The dawnings, the first developments of peculiar talent appearing within his range and under his rule, curiously excited, even disturbed him. He watched it struggle into life with a scowl. He held back his hand, perhaps said, "Come on if you have strength," but would not aid the birth. When the pang and peril of the first conflict were over, when the breath of life was drawn, when he saw the lungs expand and contract, when he felt the heartbeat and discovered life in the eye, he did not yet offer to foster. "Prove yourself true ere I cherish you," was his ordinance. And how difficult he made that proof! What thorns and briars, what flints he strewed in the path of feet not inured to rough travel! He watched tearlessly ordeals that he extracted should be passed through, fearlessly. He followed footprints that, as they approached the bourne, were sometimes marked in blood, followed them grimly, holding the austerest police watch over the pain-pressed pilgrim. And when at last he allowed a rest, before slumber might close the eyelids, he opened those same lids wide, with pitiless finger and thumb, and gazed deep through the pupil and the iris into the brain, into the heart, to search if vanity or pride or falsehood, in any of its subtlest forms, was discoverable in the furthest recess of existence. If, at last, he let the neophyte sleep, it was but a moment. He woke him suddenly up to apply new tests. He sent him on irksome errands when he was staggering with weariness. He tried the temper, the sense, and the health. And it was only when every severest test had been applied and endured, when the most corrosive aqua fortis had been used, and failed to tarnish the ore, that he admitted it genuine, and, still in clouded silence, stamped it with his deep brand of approval. I speak not ignorant of these evils. Till the date at which the last chapter closes, Monsieur Paul had not been my professor. He had not given me lessons, but, about that time, accidentally hearing me one day acknowledge an ignorance of some branch of education, I think it was arithmetic, which would have disgraced a charity school boy, as he very truly remarked, he took me in hand, examined me first, found me, I need not say, abundantly deficient, gave me some books, and appointed me some tasks. He did this at first with pleasure, indeed with unconcealed exultation, condescending to say that he believed I was bonne et pas trop faible, i.e. well enough disposed and not wholly destitute of parts, but owing, he supposed, to adverse circumstances, as yet in a state of wretchedly imperfect mental development. The beginning of all effort has indeed with me been marked by a preternatural imbecility. I never could, even in forming a common acquaintance, assert or prove a claim to average quickness. A depressing and difficult passage has prefaced every new page I have turned in life. So long as this passage lasted, Monsieur Paul was very kind, very good, very forbearing. He saw the sharp pain inflicted, and felt the weighty humiliation imposed by my own sense of incapacity, and words can hardly do justice to his tenderness and helpfulness. His own eyes would moisten when tears of shame and effort clouded mine. Burdened as he was with work, he would steal half his brief space of recreation to give to me. But, strange grief, when that heavy and overcast dawn began at last to yield to day, when my faculties began to struggle themselves free, and my time of energy and fulfilment came, when I voluntarily doubled, trebled, quadrupled the tasks he set to please him, as I thought, his kindness became sternness, the light changed in his eyes from a beam to a spark. He fretted, he opposed, he curbed me imperiously. The more I did, the harder I worked, the less he seemed content. Sarcasms of which the severity amazed and puzzled me harassed my ears. Then flowed out the bitterest innuendos against the pride of intellect. I was vaguely threatened with I know not what doom, if I ever trespassed the limits proper to my sex, and conceived a contraband appetite for unfeminine knowledge. Alas, I had no such appetite. What I loved it joyed me by any effort to content, but the noble hunger for science in the abstract, the godlike thirst after discovery, these feelings were known to me but by briefest flashes. Yet when Monsieur Paul sneered at me, I wanted to possess them more fully. His injustice stirred in me ambitious wishes. It imparted a strong stimulus. It gave wings to aspiration. In the beginning, before I had penetrated to motives, that uncomprehended sneer of his made my heart ache. But by and by it only warmed the blood in my veins, and sent added action to my pulses. Whatever my powers, feminine or the contrary, God had given them, and I felt resolute to be ashamed of no faculty of his bestowal. The combat was very sharp for a time. I seemed to have lost Monsieur Paul's affection. He treated me strangely. In his most unjust moments he would insinuate that I had deceived him when I appeared what he called faible, that is, incompetent. He said I had feigned a false incapacity. Again he would turn suddenly round and accuse me of the most far-fetched imitations and impossible plagiarisms, asserting that I had extracted the pith out of books I could not so much as heard of, and over the perusal of which I should infallibly have fallen down in a sleep as deep as that of Eutychus. Once, upon his preferring such an accusation, I turned upon him. I rose against him. Gathering an armful of his books out of my desk, I filled my apron and poured them in a heap upon his estrade, at his feet. "Take them away, Monsieur Paul," I said, "and teach me no more. I never asked to be made learned, and you compel me to feel very profoundly that learning is not happiness." And returning to my desk, I laid my head on my arms. Nor would I speak to him for 2 days afterwards. He pained and chagrined me. His affection had been very sweet and dear, a pleasure new and incomparable. Now that this seemed withdrawn, I cared not for his lessons. The books, however, were not taken away. They were all restored with careful hand to their places, and he came as usual to teach me. He made his peace somehow, too readily perhaps. I ought to have stood out longer, but when he looked kind and good, and held out his hand with amity, memory refused to reproduce with due force his oppressive moments. And then reconcilement is always sweet. On a certain morning a message came from my godmother, inviting me to attend some notable lecture to be delivered in the same public rooms before described. Dr. John had brought the message himself, and delivered it verbally to Rosine, who had not scrupled to follow the steps of Monsieur Emmanuel, then passing to the first class, and in his presence stand carrément before my desk, hand in apron pocket, and rehearse the same, saucily and aloud, concluding with the words, "Qu'il est vraiment beau, mademoiselle, ce jeune docteur. Quels yeux, quel regard! Tenez, j'en ai le cœur tout ému." When she was gone, my professor demanded of me why I suffered "cette fille effrontée, cette créature sans pudeur," to address me in such terms. I had no pacifying answer to give. The terms were precisely such as Rosine, a young lady in whose skull the organs of reverence and reserve were not largely developed, was in the constant habit of using. Besides, what she said about the young doctor was true enough. Graham was handsome. He had fine eyes and a thrilling glance. An observation to that effect actually formed itself into sound on my lips. "Elle ne dit que la vérité," I said. "Ah, vous trouvez?" "Mais sans doute." The lesson to which we had that day to submit was such as to make us very glad when it terminated. At its close the released pupils rushed out, half trembling, half exultant. I too was going. A mandate to remain arrested me. I muttered that I wanted some fresh air badly. The stove was in a glow, the class overheated. An inexorable voice merely recommended silence. And this salamander, for whom no room ever seemed too hot, sitting down between my desk and the stove, a situation in which he ought to have felt broiled, but did not, proceeded to confront me with a Greek quotation. In Monsieur Emmanuel's soul rankled a chronic suspicion that I knew both Greek and Latin. As monkeys are said to have the power of speech if they would but use it, and are reported to conceal this faculty in fear of its being turned to their detriment, so to me was ascribed a fund of knowledge which I was supposed criminally and craftily to conceal. The privileges of a classical education, it was insinuated, had been mine. On flowers of Hymethius I had revelled. A golden store, hived in memory, now silently sustained my efforts, and privily nurtured my wits. 100 expedients did Monsieur Paul employ to surprise my secret, to wheedle, to threaten, to startle it out of me. Sometimes he placed Greek and Latin books in my way, and then watched me, as Joan of Arc's jailers tempted her with the warrior's accoutrements, and lay in wait for the issue. Again he quoted I know not what authors and passages, while rolling out their sweet and sounding lines. The classic tones fell musically from his lips, for he had a good voice, remarkable for compass, modulation, and matchless expression. He would fix on me a vigilant, piercing, and often malicious eye. It was evident he sometimes expected great demonstrations. They never occurred, however. Not comprehending, of course, I could neither be charmed nor annoyed. Baffled, almost angry, he still clung to his fixed idea. My susceptibilities were pronounced marble, my face a mask. It appeared as if he could not be brought to accept the homely truth, and take me for what I was. Men, and women too, must have delusion of some sort. If not made ready to their hand, they will invent exaggeration for themselves. At moments I did wish that his suspicions had been better founded. There were times when I would have given my right hand to possess the treasures he ascribed to me. He deserved condign punishment for his testy crotchets. I could have gloried in bringing home to him his worst apprehensions astoundingly realized. I could have exulted to burst on his vision, confront and confound his lunette, one blaze of acquirements. Oh, why did nobody undertake to make me clever while I was young enough to learn, that I might by one grand, sudden, inhuman revelation, one cold, cruel, overwhelming triumph, have for ever crushed the mocking spirit out of Paul, Karl, David, Emmanuel? Alas, no such feat was in my power. Today, as usual, his quotations fell ineffectual. He soon shifted his ground. Women of intellect was his next theme. Here he was at home. A woman of intellect, it appeared, was a sort of lusus naturae, a luckless accident, a thing for which there was neither place nor use in creation, wanted neither as wife nor worker. Beauty anticipated her in the first office. He believed in his soul that lovely, placid, and passive feminine mediocrity was the only pillow on which manly thought and sense could find rest for its aching temples. And as to work, male mind alone could work to any good practical result, eh? This was a note of interrogation, intended to draw from me contradiction or objection. However, I only said, "Cela ne me regarde pas, je ne m'en soucie pas," and presently added, "May I go, monsieur? They have rung the bell for the second déjeuner," i.e. luncheon. "What of that? You are not hungry?" "Indeed I was," I said. I had had nothing since breakfast at 7, and should have nothing till dinner at 5 if I missed this bell. Well, he was in the same plight, but I might share with him. And he broke in two the brioche intended for his own refreshment, and gave me half. Truly his bark was worse than his bite, but the really formidable attack was yet to come. While eating his cake, I could not forbear expressing my secret wish that I really knew all of which he accused me. "Did I sincerely feel myself to be an ignoramus?" he asked in a softened tone. If I had replied meekly by an unqualified affirmative, I believe he would have stretched out his hand, and we should have been friends on the spot, but I answered, "Not exactly. I am ignorant, monsieur, in the knowledge you ascribe to me, but I sometimes, not always, feel a knowledge of my own." "What did I mean?" he inquired sharply. Unable to answer this question in a breath, I evaded it by change of subject. He had now finished his half of the brioche, feeling sure that on so trifling a fragment he could not have satisfied his appetite, as indeed I had not appeased mine, and inhaling the fragrance of baked apples afar from the refectory, I ventured to inquire whether he did not also perceive that agreeable odour. He confessed that he did. I said if he would let me out by the garden door, and permit me just to run across the court, I would fetch him a plateful, and added that I believed they were excellent, as Goton had a very good method of baking, or rather stewing fruit, putting in a little spice, sugar, and a glass or two of vin blanc. Might I go? "Petite gourmande," said he, smiling. "I have not forgotten how pleased you were with the pâté à la crème I once gave to you, and you know very well at this moment that to fetch the apples from me will be the same as getting them for yourself. Go then, but come back quickly." At last he liberated me on parole. My own plan was to go and return with speed and good faith, to put the plate in at the door, and then to vanish incontinent, leaving all consequences for future settlement. That intolerably keen instinct of his seemed to have anticipated my scheme. He met me at the threshold, hurried me into the room, and fixed me in a minute in my former seat. Taking the plate of fruit from my hand, he divided the portion intended only for himself, and ordered me to eat my share. I complied with no good grace, and vexed, I suppose, by my reluctance, he opened a masked and dangerous battery. All he had yet said I could count as mere sound and fury, signifying nothing. Not so of the present attack. It consisted in an unreasonable proposition with which he had before afflicted me, namely, that on the next public examination day I should engage, foreigner as I was, to take my place on the first form of first-class pupils, and with them improvise a composition in French, on any subject any spectator might dictate, without benefit of grammar or lexicon. I knew what the result of such an experiment would be, I, to whom nature had denied the impromptu faculty, who in public was by nature a cipher, whose time of mental activity, even when alone, was not under the meridian sun, who needed the fresh silence of morning or the recluse peace of evening to win from the creative impulse one evidence of his presence, one proof of his force. I, with whom that impulse was the most intractable, the most capricious, the most maddening of masters, him before me always excepted, a deity which sometimes, under circumstances apparently propitious, would not speak when questioned, would not hear when appealed to, would not, when sought, be found, but would stand, all cold, all indurated, all granite, a dark bale with carven lips and blank eyeballs and breast like the stone face of a tomb. And again, suddenly, at some turn, some sound, some long trembling sob of the wind, at some rushing past of an unseen stream of electricity, the irrational demon would wake unsolicited, would stir strangely alive, would rush from its pedestal like a perturbed Dagon calling to its votary for a sacrifice, whatever the hour, to its victim for some blood or some breath, whatever the circumstance or scene, rousing its priest, treacherously promising vaticination, perhaps filling its temple with a strange hum of oracles, but sure to give half the significance to fateful winds, and grudging to the desperate listener even a miserable remnant, yielding it sordidly, as though each word had been a drop of the deathless ichor of its own dark veins. And this tyrant I was to compel into bondage and make it improvise a theme on a school estrade between a Mathilde and a Coralie, under the eye of a Madame Beck, for the pleasure and to the inspiration of a bourgeois of la basse-cour. Upon this argument Monsieur Paul and I did battle more than once, strong battle with confused noise of demand and rejection, exaction and repulse. On this particular day I was soundly rated. The obstinacy of my whole sex, it seemed, was concentrated in me. I had an orgueil de diable. I feared to fail, forsooth. What did it matter whether I failed or not? Who was I that I should not fail like my betters? It would do me good to fail. He wanted to see me worsted, I knew he did, and 1 minute he paused to take breath. Would I speak now and be tractable? Never would I be tractable in this matter. Law itself should not compel me. I would pay a fine or undergo an imprisonment, rather than write for a show and to order, perched up on a platform. Could softer motives influence me? Would I yield for friendship's sake? Not a whit, not a hairbreadth. No form of friendship under the sun had a right to exact such a concession. No true friendship would harass me thus. He supposed then, with a sneer, Monsieur Paul could sneer supremely, curling his lip, opening his nostrils, contracting his eyelids. He supposed there was but one form of appeal to which I would listen, and of that form it was not for him to make use. Under certain persuasions from certain crotteurs, je vous vois d'ici, said he, eagerly subscribing to the sacrifice, passionately arming for the effort. Making a simpleton, a warning, and an example of myself before 150 of the papas and mammas of Villette. And here, losing patience, I broke out afresh with a cry that I wanted to be liberated, to get out into the air. I was almost in a fever. Chut, said the inexorable. This was a mere pretext to run away. He was not hot, with the stove close at his back. How could I suffer, thoroughly screened by his person? I did not understand his constitution. I knew nothing of the natural history of salamanders. For my own part, I was a phlegmatic islander, and sitting in an oven did not agree with me. At least might I step to the well and get a glass of water. The sweet apples had made me thirsty. If that was all, he would do my errand. He went to fetch the water. Of course, with the door only on the latch behind me, I lost not my opportunity. Ere his return, his half-worried prey had escaped. End of chapter 30.